global temperatures meet or break records as climate change continues unabated? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Amid the global pandemic, climate change marches on. The first half of 2020 was the second warmest ever recorded. And it's becoming more likely the entire year could become the hottest on record. Put another way, the 5 warmest years have occurred since 2015, with 2020 highly likely to become the hottest since records have been kept. For more, we turn now to CGTN's Sean Calebs. And Sean, you were just in Texas, where parts of the state they experience record temperatures. And Texas, of course, is not alone. This is a global problem. Where are we seeing, or what are we seeing in terms of the biggest impact and how and why this is happening?
Yeah, let me try to put this in perspective a bit. In fact, we can actually start in Texas, because right now they are still cleaning up in the aftermath of Hurricane Hannah. Now, that was a tropical storm as it moved into the Gulf of Mexico, but the warm waters there superheated that storm at the last minute, made it a strong Category 1, caught some people off guard. That's important because the continent of Africa, of course, is experiencing near or record high temperatures, and the winds that blow off there come across the heated Atlantic Ocean and then pick up, and that's where the storms come in that threaten the Caribbean, the United States, Mexico, Central America, and it is predicted it's going to be a very, very active year. But if you look at where the most dramatic impacts are being felt right now, in the Arctic, it is warming up twice as fast as any place on Earth, and it's really on a kind of a vicious cycle, because as things warm up and the snow and the ice begins to melt, and as aerosols drop onto that white snow and ice, it becomes darker, and where the snow and ice was, as it gives way, it no longer reflects the sun's energy. It absorbs it, and so that makes the Arctic even warmer. We were up there a few years ago doing a documentary, and the permafrost is melting. Permafrost, of course, is ground that is supposed to be permanently frozen, and as it begins to thaw, it releases methane into the air, and that makes for more greenhouse gases, and of course scientists say that is what is blamed for superheating the atmosphere.
Sean, you know, there was speculation early that the warm weather, higher temperatures, might help suppress the coronavirus. That doesn't seem to be the case, but climate change and the virus are linked in other ways, aren't they?
Yeah, they really are, and in very many ways. A lot of people did look at that early on when in this hemisphere we were in the winter. But if you look at Singapore, when the outbreak first happened in China, it was very warm there and did very little to curb the strain and the way it was easily transmitted to other people, and it certainly has not been the case here in the United States. But if you look at really the way the virus and right now the climate change are really being affected, so many people really thought that as we moved forward, stop using cars, stop flying as much, you're going to not burn the fossil fuels, so you won't have as much carbon monoxide in the air. But that really has done very little to drop that greenhouse gas, because for years and years and years, all the greenhouse gases in the United States, in the world, it's going to take a long time for all of that to burn off. And secondly, if you look at the way people are having to make difficult decisions, government leaders, do we move to try to open up the economy and do things that could put the environment more in jeopardy, or do you keep the environment number one? That is a big wrestling match that countries are going through right now, and there is a very important climate conference that's going to take place in Glasgow, Scotland. It is the first international UN climate conference since the all-important Paris Accord that really set the tone moving forward to try to keep the climate change under control and keep the temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees centigrade since the Industrial Revolution. Of course, the United States and President Donald Trump have opted out of that. A lot of other countries are looking at it and saying, well, if the United States isn't going to do it, how are we going to move forward, especially when we have to make these very difficult decisions, economy versus the environment. That is what everybody's going to be looking at. They had to push that climate conference back to November because of the coronavirus, and who knows, it may have to be moved once again. On it.
Thanks, Sean. That's CGTN's Sean Calebs reporting from just outside Greenville in Tennessee. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Paul Bledsoe served as a climate advisor to U.S. President Bill Clinton. He currently advises the Progressive Policy Institute and heads his own consulting firm right here in Washington, D.C. Sweta Chakraborty is a risk and behavioural scientist with expertise in climate science. Changhua Wu heads the Beijing Future Innovation Center and serves as executive director of the Professional Association for China's Environment. And Alice Hill is a senior fellow for climate change policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and co-author of Building a Resilient Tomorrow: How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruption. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Alice Hill, let me start with you. Last year, Europe saw record temperatures, according to information from the Copernicus Institute, that's the European Climate Change Service. 11 of the 12 warmest years have occurred since 2000. What is your reading, your assessment of what's happening?
We're heating up quickly, and we will continue to heat up even faster going forward. Climate change is accelerating, and unfortunately, even if we were able to cut our emissions to zero tomorrow, we would continue to heat up just because of the baked-in emissions that we already have in the atmosphere. So we're going to see more extremes of heat, drought, storms, wildfires going forward, and obviously we are challenged globally to be prepared for the type of extremes that really humans have never experienced, at least not in recorded history.
Yeah, Alice, interesting point you make that even if we had to cut emissions to zero tomorrow, we'd still have problems. Is this too late?
No, we're not too late, but it will take very aggressive action to keep ourselves under that 1.5 degrees Celsius that the scientists and others have agreed is the maximum temperature increase we can suffer and still be relatively safe. We will continue to heat up, but presumably we can withstand those impacts. It's the uncontrollable heating that will bring us really events that will be very difficult for human civilization to deal with. Rapid sea level rise, extreme temperatures that will make some portions of the globe uninhabitable. I know it sounds like a science fiction prediction, but these are actually the predictions that climate scientists and the modeling tell us are in our future if we don't cut our emissions.
Sweta, as Sean Caleb's told us in his report, there is now significant evidence of extreme weather near the Arctic Circle. Let's listen to what Petteri Talas, the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Service, had to say. Let's listen to this.
We have seen more than double the global warming in the Arctic, and that's going to continue. Then these tropical zones will face lower temperature changes than the global average, and then we estimate that there will be also changes in precipitation patterns for the coming 5 years, and for example, South America and Australia and some parts of Africa would face more severe drought during the coming 5 years, and there's an estimation that in Western Europe we would see more often storms than we have seen in the past.
So, Sweta, how will life change in the next 5 years, listening to what Petteri Talas had to tell us there?
Yeah, and so it does sound really scary. We know that warming begets more warming, and what we refer to this in our community is as vicious feedback loops. So the warmer it gets, the more we can expect it to exponentially increase, and the impacts we feel, as Alice just mentioned, through hurricanes, through droughts, through increased heat waves. This is one of the warmest summers I'm sure many of us are coexisting with, and it's one of those things that we have to anticipate to be the new baseline and prepare and adapt ourselves as we think about how life is going to change and how we are going to live and adapt to a warmer environment. Our species has never existed at this temperature point, and it's something that we really need to recognize is a culmination of our behaviors. It's not that COVID is going to be able to get us off this trajectory towards a warmer planet, even if we voluntarily chose to continue to see this kind of emissions reductions on a yearly basis. This is something we're locked into, and it's a baseline we need to accept, and we need to think really critically about how to adapt to.
Sweta, if the temperatures get to the point where certain parts of the planet would be uninhabitable, that means it's going to be a massive movement of people as well, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And we're already seeing migrants moving because of the climate. We're seeing increased civil strife happening all around the world. The Sahel region of Africa is a good example. And it makes sense because you are going to see temperature increases that, again, these communities that have lived and survived and thrived on for generations are no longer farmable. And so these are populations of people that are going to be seeking new opportunities. And so, of course, with that is going to come more of these systematic migrations. And it's something that, again, we need to anticipate and recognize is going to increase in frequency and intensity as the planet continues to warm. But we can stave off those worst case scenarios. And that's the most important thing to keep in mind.
All right, let me bring Paul into the conversation. Paul, there was quite a bit of hope, a bit of euphoria, actually, when the Paris Climate Change Accord was signed. The target was to keep temperatures below 2% from pre-industrial levels. I want to go back to Petteri Talas and what he had to say about that. Let's listen to this.
So far, we haven't been very successful in implementation of the Paris Agreement. The greenhouse gas concentrations, especially carbon dioxide concentration, still continues in the atmosphere, and that's the main reason for this warming.
So, Paul, as he says there, we have not been very successful. What are the big challenges to implementation of that deal?
Well, he's right that so far we have not been reducing greenhouse gas emissions anywhere near as quickly as we need to. This is a global emergency, and we're not treating it like one. The irony, however, is that the COVID crisis and the economic depression globally that has begun is spurring many leaders to create New Deal type clean energy economic recoveries. We note that in the EU, they have talked about a 750 billion euro Green New Deal to reduce emissions and put people back to work. Joe Biden has proposed a $2 trillion green energy infrastructure package. This could be the most important energy revolution since John D. Rockefeller discovered oil, since Henry Ford discovered the Model T car, and since Edison invented the light bulb. We now have the technology to reduce emissions to zero in the next 30 years and prevent the worst of climate change while we save our economy. This is a massive moment. Money is cheap. Overall interest rates are either zero or negative. We can do this now, but it's going to take the world waking up and realizing, United States voters realizing they can't afford another 4 years of Donald Trump, European voters realizing they can't back climate deniers in Eastern Europe or those like Bolsonaro in Brazil. Yep. The world has got to realize we have the opportunity to deal with this economic and environmental crisis together.
Paul, very quickly, very briefly, when you talk about this change, this revolution, in practical terms, what does it mean?
Fortunately, the cost of renewable energy has fallen 80% in the last 10 years. Electric vehicles are now cheaper to operate than gasoline vehicles, all costs included. But what we have to do is provide incentives to bring those new technologies into the marketplace. So governments have to have a big role in making it cheaper for consumers and businesses to invest in these new choices. The long-term opportunity is immense because we'll have cleaner air, we'll have less public health problems, and will reduce warming that otherwise is going to swamp our economies. This may be the most important economic energy transition that has ever occurred.
Changhua Wu, China over the last decade has positioned itself as being a champion in the battle against climate change. The country has lowered its own emissions as well, and it's lowered energy use as well. What are the biggest challenges that China faces right now?
I think fossil fuel remains the biggest challenge. Of course, the political will is clear. We're definitely going to phase out coal, but with a timetable. And ideally, China is already the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and every year we continue to emit more. So a much accelerated phasing out of fossil fuels will be an ideal scenario. But at this moment, just somehow the global climate change challenges And the situation in China, in particular, in terms of pace, seems not very much, sort of meshed together at this moment. But as I said, as colleagues earlier on said already, we all live in this, climate change, crisis, essential crisis already. And actions are coming together, particularly riding on the wave, the opportunity of the we call it green recovery. Besides the EU and the US, China, the exciting development from China is that China has rolled out something called the new infrastructure scheme as pretty much the highlight of its green stimulus package for this round of efforts now. In that, you could tell clearly digitalization is a big part of it, because we do need to ride on the technology innovation and build up the digital infrastructure in order to accelerate the process. EV charging stations infrastructure there, but also other mobility like high-speed rail and light rail, plus smart grid technologies there. So I just want to say, yeah, the challenge is huge, and ideally everyone would like China to accelerate this clean revolution process, but unfortunately at this very moment the pace wouldn't be able to really match with the challenge we're facing. But on the other side, we are all jumping on this sort of opportunity so that we're going to accelerate the transformation together with the global community.
Anand, if I could jump in
here. Yeah,
sure.
Go ahead.
China's attempts to export its fossil fuels technology have got to stop. They are still building coal-fired power plants in Africa and elsewhere around the world. It's time for them to stop that and to begin to wean themselves out of coal domestically. They have the opportunity to do this. They're a brilliant manufacturing economy of electric vehicles, of solar panels. The U.S. has to help them. You know, one of the products of the trade war between China and the U.S. that Trump has sparked is that we have not been working together with China as we did under Obama with President Xi to bring forward the technologies that we all need. If Biden is elected, I believe that Xi and Biden can work together so that both the U.S. and China can produce these new technologies. China is responsible for double the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, 30% of the total. We cannot reduce global emissions unless China does.
Changhua Wu, very quickly, your response to that. Is there a recognition in China that while it might make its own efforts to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases in the country, that it also has to stop encouraging the use of fossil fuels in other countries?
I agree. I accept the reality that, just Paul mentioned the situation, but then there's the other side, which is more fascinating. Give you one example. For instance, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, which is a major financing investment vehicle initiated by China, but now with 102 global member states actually in it, committed to zero investment in coal. And this is a large development investment, actually, infrastructure investment platform, and it is happening. And so this literally, you started to see the first green infrastructure investment bank is born, right? And so, yes, there are a lot of issues in reality, but in the meantime, I think more and more efforts are now pulled into action pod. Yeah.
Alice, what are your thoughts on what we heard from two of our panelists, the fact that the coronavirus pandemic right now gives us, and the tanking of economies in consequence, gives the world the opportunity now to make this shift towards green technologies?
It absolutely is the opportunity to make the change. Of course, we are in very dire economic straits, and the fear is that once we get back, our economies back, we will see emissions continue to lurch forward. And in fact, that's what's happened in China. Its emissions levels are just about back to what they used to be. And that has huge consequences. So unless there is an opportunity for the nations across the globe to come to a real agreement to do better even than the Paris Agreement, it will be extremely challenging to get these emissions down. And the pandemic has interfered with the ability of the global leaders to convene on these issues. So we've seen major conferences be postponed because of the virus. So yes, it's an opportunity, but there are many pitfalls ahead, and we need to make sure that there is continued pressure to make progress. It's in the interest of everyone and every nation to see progress in this space.
Can I jump in? Yeah, can I jump in
Yeah,
here?
very quickly. Sure, very quickly.
Yeah, sure. That's why actually back to the international multilateral process, which turns to be more important and needed than ever, because we need leadership. We need the UN leadership to convene all the key major economies together, continue the effort. What's encouraging is that the EU Green Deal, potentially US New Green Deal coming up, we'll see after the election, and China's effort stepping up with the three big elephants in the room, that creates tremendous opportunity actually to transform. But very importantly, the three have to really, really work together in order to do so.
Right. Sweta, I asked our reporter, at the beginning of the show on the connection between the pandemic and climate change. Where do you see the biggest connection?
I see it in that the scientists have been warning us about what is coming with climate change for decades, and there was a head in the sand type response from the public and the representatives of the public in government. Similarly, with COVID-19, there was recognition from the science community for also decades since we saw the emergence of the 1918 Spanish flu and the amount of studies that have gone in since to infectious disease. Tracking and monitoring around the world, that a disease like COVID-19 was not if, but when. And so with that connection, that recognition that there are experts out there that spend their careers studying and understanding the different risks that we face as a global populace that need to be taken seriously and acted upon through evidence-based policymaking, that is the clear connection there, is that these two things have been largely ignored but require our attention and proactive preparedness.
And so, how will climate change impact the fight against the coronavirus, especially in poorer countries?
So it's always those that are most vulnerable that suffer first and foremost. And unfortunately, despite the initial excitement that was made around the renewable energy sector, we're still seeing the renewable energy sector get hit just like every other sector get hit. And the promise that was there for a lot of the different economic recovery plans, part of the stimulus bills that we're talking about post-COVID, this is all also going to impact potential opportunities, not just for countries but across also socioeconomic, that spectrum. And so here, the opportunities that existed or could exist going into the future for a lot of these smaller countries and vulnerable populations have also been delayed or stalled. So it's something we really need to think about in terms of how we are going to follow what the European Union is doing and ensure that that stimulus recovery plan across the globe really fits in protection for these communities through economic means.
Anand, this is Paul. That's exactly right. There's a huge social justice angle to climate change. In fact, you could say that climate change will be the biggest social justice challenge ever. And the reason is because billions of people are going to be struggling with incredible heat, with droughts, with storms, with denuded farm economies. We have to begin to invest in resilience while we decarbonize. We have to do both. Populations in South Asia, in Africa, in South America, even in places like the United States are incredibly vulnerable. One other thing I wanted to add that Sean brought up, the Arctic is melting. The great ice shield that is the Arctic has prevented huge amounts of heat from spinning climate change out of control, such that warming in the natural systems will beget warming. My colleague Durward Zelke and I published an essay in the New York Times on this recently. We believe that there has to be intense international action to protect the Arctic ice, or we may face runaway warming that no amount of emissions reductions can stop.
Yeah. Alice, I want to ask you about that. We know that ice is melting at the poles. It's also melting on mountain glaciers and things like that. And there is a tendency to believe, you read even the newspapers today, that climate change is something that's going to happen in the future. It's way out there. It isn't happening right now. How big a mistake is that?
It's a very, very big mistake. And part of it stems from our modeling, the major modeling that we've done for climate. It's so computer intensive that we've often used very long time frames, 2100, and that's difficult for the human brain to use in terms of assessing risk. But it's also fed this notion that climate change is something far off in the future. It doesn't affect me or my family. In fact, our polling typically shows that. People say, yeah, I know climate change is happening, but it won't happen to me. So it is an obstacle to action. I think that's one thing that COVID has helped with. It has made all of us understand and feel and experience catastrophic risk, which really isn't a common experience until now. And then we've seen the wide variations in terms of who's most hurt and who is doing better. And it's usually on an economic and sometimes racial divide. So that will be illustrative of what is ahead for us. I would say most immediately, we all need to be concerned about what has been termed a hunger pandemic that's resulting from the current pandemic.
Right.
And that will even bring more to home that food insecurity, as we've heard earlier, is essential in terms of what we can expect going forward with climate change.
Changhua, I'm going to talk about something, and I've only got a minute, unfortunately, but that is ocean heat. We don't talk about this very often, but Chinese researchers say that there's a layer of water between depths of 200 up to 1,000 meters in the South China Sea, which stored more heat than during any other period since the glacial period. What role does ocean heat play in climate change?
Tremendous. So from scientific perspective, so when the solar actually radiates, and now large part of the heat, probably 80% of the heat absorbed by the ocean, and so the consequences are because the water cycle of the planet Earth actually. So when you get more heat in the ocean, and that's going to impact actually the currents flow, and then of course there will be more water evaporated from ocean. And I think scientists are telling us that at least 5% more evaporation from ocean now happening, and because and that is tremendous amount of atmospheric river in the air. And so when they downpour, then we see flooding. Then other regions experience droughts. So that's very devastating.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.